a listener tuning into this conversation and not reading A Thousand Naked Strangers, because that was, that's kind of our audience. I think it's the kind of the occult folk, not occult, but you know what I'm saying, like the good sense of humor. But if you don't mind, man, just introduce yourself and um, bring bring us to how you got to work at Grady, how you got into EMS. What brought you to this world, to the world of EMS?
I, I backed into it like almost everybody else, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
So yeah, look, I was I was a normal person, regular civilian. Yep, just doing my thing, and was out of college, and was working as a reporter, bored as hell. 9/11 happens, and anyone who was around at that time
Mhm.
remembers that there was this crazy sense in the air that, like, you know, um, it's so much different than where we are right now. But everybody kind of felt like we were in this thing together. And there was, I think a lot of us had this feeling that, like, I should be doing something that is not necessarily more or bigger or better, but something that felt more for the collective. Like, how can I
Mm.
give back? You know, and I stumble upon EMS. That I've told the story 1,000 times now. I
Yeah.
won't bore people with it, but I covered a story that involved EMS, and it was, I think for a lot of people who, there's that small clique of people who grew up watching Emergency and who knew from the time they were 5 that they were going to be a paramedic. But for the
Mm.
rest of us, something happens somewhere along the way, and it's just all of a sudden this, like, oh wow, here's this crazy thing that I can do. I can step through this world into this, or through this door into this other world, and have this crazy experience, and someone's going to pay me for it. And when you're 24 years old, I mean, that's like a really appealing option. And at first, I thought maybe I would be a firefighter because it seemed like it was kind of cool. Like, you got to do a lot of fun stuff. But the second I was exposed to Grady, we had, well, Mel Teat. I don't know if you guys know Mel.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
came and he helped out with my EMT class. My instructor had been a Grady medic from the early days, so I heard all these crazy Grady stories. And then Mel came in, and there were some more Grady stories. And then we did our third rides with Grady,
Mm.
and instantly I was like, oh man, like this is where I this has to be it. This is where I want to be.
Do you think being a journalist and somebody who appreciates, writing and the written word, do you think that kind of played into how much you enjoyed being on the streets? Like, do you think that you maybe saw some dynamics and some characteristics of the job that other people were overlooking?
I
Like the int-
definitely I definitely got sucked into the weird, the other world,
yeah.
in a way that, maybe a lot of people would want to, spend an afternoon at like Piedmont and Monroe or something because you can get all kinds of good food. I wanted to be, at the corner of Sunset and Brawley. I wanted to be kind of right in the middle of everything. I loved that weird, I keep saying weird. That's not, but from my perspective, I loved being exposed to something totally new that felt very extreme.
Mm.
They were the things that were happening there. That was the reason I got into EMS, regardless of what the call might be. And just to drive around those streets, which felt, I mean, you guys have been there, you drive around the bluff,
Yeah.
it just feels, it feels different from where I grew up. And so that, like,
Hmm.
it was kind of like, I don't know, it was almost a bit like watching a movie. You're kind of being transported to this neighborhood where everything is the opposite of what you're used to, and people's interaction with EMS was so strong. And then of course Grady, like the history of Grady and sort of all the stuff that goes into it, whether it's the fact that everybody else's fire base or
Hmm.
private company, and you're this weird hospital based thing, and people are like, hey, we're short on supplies, so when you get in, they steal a load of 18s. um
Absolutely.
and just like the fact that psych was on the 13th floor. I mean, I
Yeah.
certainly fell in love with all of the eccentricities that came with working a job there.
So let me ask you to go back for just a second. You said that you're working as a journalist and you decided you wanted to maybe try this EMT thing. As instructors, we get a lot of students that come in not having a clue about what actually being an EMT or a paramedic is. Do you remember that time where it kind of just either clicked with you, like, yeah, this is really what I want to do, or what surprised you most about what you were thought you were getting into versus what it actually was?
I will say it turned out to be what I thought I was getting myself into. The thing that surprised me was how much you have to be able to understand very complex interpersonal dynamics. You know, I've told the story before that early on in my career, we had this guy who was always angry when we picked him up, and he was just a jerk to everybody. And one day, I pick him up, and you know how it is on an ambulance. Somebody can say something to you that will roll off your back. Where if they said it to you on the street and you weren't at work, like it would be a fight.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those days where he kind of caught me by surprise when he said it. And I just immediately turned around and started going back at him. And we, you know, we're in the back of the ambulance as occasionally happens. We're kind of jawing at each other. And I got control of myself. I was like, this is stupid. Like I'm sitting here arguing with this guy who's, you know, one step away from being homeless and goes to Grady, you know, 4 or 5 times a week. Like he has enough going on in his life without arguing with me. So I kind of backed off. And then I said, hey, let me ask you a question. Why are you like this? Why is it that every time I pick you up, you're like, I just don't get it. It doesn't have to be this way. Like this relationship could be a lot better. And, you know, up until that moment, he had been like really sharp and just going at me nonstop. And finally, like all of a sudden this calmness settles over his face. And he's like, look, man, I have AIDS and my family doesn't want to be around me. My friends don't want to be around me. So I'm going to die alone. And I'm scared and I'm angry and I take it out on you. I'm 25, 26. Like I'm not equipped to handle that. Nobody had said to me, hey, by the way, you're going to be dealing with people who are going through such extraordinary experiences that you can't even fathom. And you're going to have to find a way to like, you know, to relate to those people and to help those people and to not to help them in a medical way, but help them in a very like small, but very personal, mature way, which I was not mature enough yet to do that. And that was a huge, so to me, that was the biggest surprise. You know, all the other stuff, I entered into EMT school terrified. I thought for sure I was not going to be able to handle it. The blood and the trauma and all those things that, you know, stay in the job long enough, you will run on every call you ever wanted to run. I got those. That to me was the biggest surprise. And in terms of like when it began to click with me, I got maybe a third of the way into that class and we were learning, and I'm sure you guys had the similar experience in EMT school. It's the first time you're in a school where you're learning like practical skills. And, you know, here's how you recognize a stroke. Here's how you treat low blood sugar. Here's, you know, all these, like, here's how you deliver a baby, all these things that were happening. And that was it was exciting, but it wasn't scary the way in the beginning, the thought of, you know, getting sent out to someone who'd been hit by a car and was, you know, dying at your feet was scary the way it can be when you first enter school. It was more like, wow, like I'm learning how to do this stuff. Like this is a legitimate skill. And that was, I don't know, it was very enticing.
And then at what point in your career did you start thinking about, man, people really need to hear these? Or was that just a natural progression as someone who came out of journalism? Is it like a songwriter? Are you always thinking about how you're going to put what you're experiencing into words?
I didn't want to do it at all. I resisted it. Weird thing is I kept all these notes because I loved the details. There were these things, the fact that, you know, if somebody wanted money, if somebody was asking someone else for money, they would say, let me hold $5. Or people would say, instead of where I live, where I stay. Nobody watched TV. They looked at it. So I'd write down all these little things and some of the stuff that I saw and the way things would smell and feel, because I felt like, oh, there's some sort of story in this world, but I never thought it was going to be an EMS story. I resisted that very, very, you know, for a long time. And then people are always, you know, friends always ask, you know, like, oh, tell me some crazy story. Tell me some crazy story. And, we've all had that moment where somebody asks you, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? And you make the mistake of telling them. You get 30 seconds into it and realize, like, oh, this is not what they wanted. What they really, nobody wants a baby in a microwave. They want the funny story.
Right.
So you tell the funny stories, and then you get to telling them so often. And then you show up at a bar. They're like, hey, this is Steve. Steve, listen to this story, man. Hazzard, tell him this story. And you're like, dude, like Steve, I don't even know Steve. And here I am telling Steve how I found this guy with a shoe up his ass yesterday. And so I started writing, I started a blog. This was kind of when those things were fairly new. And I started writing one. And what happened was maybe like 6 months into me doing these things, I'd written like 5, 6 maybe. And I get this email from a friend who I had not spoken to in years. And he said, hey, man, I read this thing and it seems like your sense of humor. And I scroll through and it's like, this email has been forwarded. It made its way through both Australia and Scotland. And it was one of my blog posts.
Oh, no way.
And it made its way home. And I thought, all right, this isn't just a bar story. There's something broader here. There's a larger story that people are interested in. And that was the very first time. And that was probably 2010. That was the very first time that I thought, okay, all right, maybe, and it took me a few more years before I did it. But that was the first moment I thought, okay, maybe I'll write this particular story.
And I love how you spoke about the interpersonal relationships, because I would 100% highly agree with, that was what I learned as well. I grew up in a very rural part of Georgia, and it was a huge culture shock for me personally to work down at Grady. But another thing that I really appreciate that you touched on was how the community at large, for the most part, they loved you. Like, they loved Grady. The rooters, so to speak, they would literally be happy most of the time whenever you're driving by. I didn't experience that anywhere else I worked in my career. Nowhere else I worked. I don't know, Jason, if it was like that for you anywhere out in Texas or anything, but not a bit. Not a bit.
No, it was unique, and Atlanta is unique. So, Kevin, I don't know if maybe other people that you've talked to, does it seem like your experience was unique, or you hear a lot of the same stories in a lot of the same urban areas?
No, I think there are certain things that are universal. Certain communities rely on EMS more than others, and that fosters a certain type of relationship between patient and provider that you don't get anywhere else. But the unique relationship between the community and Grady is not something. I started out. I did a short period of time at Rural Metro when I first got my numbers. It wasn't like that at Rural Metro. Like, nobody down on Old National Highway, which is very similar, from a demographic point of view to Bankhead. Nobody had those sort of people didn't wave to you on the street. People didn't say like, oh, there goes Rural Metro. Whereas when Grady pulled up, like, everybody like, oh, hey, it's Grady's.
Yep.
It is a unique, people talk about being Grady babies their whole lives. They will talk about that, and as much as that hospital, I think frustrates a lot of people, both patient and employee alike. It's this weird thing that we all kind of need. It's a huge part of the community. There's no other way to put it.
And I think that's such an important piece. So as you were kind of set out to write your first book, 1,000 Naked Strangers, what goes into the thought process of, people watch things on TV, they watch movies, they read other books where maybe a writer is embedded with EMS folks, and they maybe tend to over dramatize or underrepresent or misrepresent certain situations. How important was it for you to really be objective without kind of over dramatizing it for artistic effect or other means?
Part of what I wanted to do with Strangers was I wanted to tell like the Fargo version of this job. I wanted every time, I really didn't watch any of those other shows. There's so many EMS shows that are on TV and still are on TV. The only book that I ever read was Bringing Out the Dead, which I thought started out well,
nice.
But then it got kind of kooky. Um, but I was like, where's the version where there are two guys who are very tired and just want to go home, and it's the last call of their shift, and they're standing over grandpa's body snickering because they're going to have to go in the other room and tell grandma that not only her husband's dead, but he's got a cucumber sticking halfway out of his ass. Like, where was that version of this job?
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of it. I wanted to tell the humor because we all laugh at each other. We laugh at our patients. We laugh at the world. We laugh at everything. Like, I wanted that to be a part of it. But then, there's also all the other things that we know that we deal with. And I wanted to express those to, I like all the things that I felt like I wanted my neighbors or friends or whoever to know, like the parts that were hard, the parts that were really funny, the parts that were boring. There's a part of this job where, you spent 7 hours staring at a windshield, behind some grocery store, parked next to a dumpster, and you're bored as hell. And it's Christmas, and you're like, really? This is how I'm spending my Christmas? Like, my kids are home opening gifts and I'm sitting here behind the Kroger on Cascade.
It's at the murder Kroger.
Right. Yeah. So like all those things come in. So I don't know. I just did my best to focus on the various experiences. I pulled a lot of it was pulling music. I pulled a ton of music that like from different eras and just listened to it. And I found weirdly that I could listen to a song and kind of remember like, oh, that's right. That's right. And like, from different stages of my career. And I just wanted to tell some version of what it felt like to me. And you guys know, like there's a feeling when your patient has done something ridiculous and it's very funny and there's you're going to tell the story for 10 years. There are those moments where like, damn, like I almost got run over by that car. That was really like, that was a crazy moment. There are those times when you're standing on someone's lawn and you have to tell them like, yeah, by the way, that's your kid back there in the shed and he's dead. Like, and that's a heavy moment. All those things exist and sometimes they exist in the same day. So it just kind of flow. I think it needed to come out because I got to be honest, it was a pretty easy book to write. Like it wasn't hard. It just came pouring out.
So I can't, you hit my heartstrings whenever you were talking about music, because to me, there seems to be a thread between Strangers and American Sirens in the history and the culture of both Grady, where Grady originated and the story behind Grady, specifically in the racial disparities and things of that nature, and then transitioning to Freedom House. What do you think is there a connection between your draw to Grady in the history as well as your draw to Freedom House and that history?
It's all kind of the same thing, I think. I'm fascinated by particularly 20th century history, as it's shaded by, kind of the rise of America, from whether that history is Buttermilk Bottom, whether that history is, us allowing United Fruit to overthrow governments in Central America, whether that history is, some, strange tale from World War II, whatever it might be. I'm fascinated by history, period. And if you're going to get into history, in my opinion, you got to get into two things. So this is what excites me about it. Who was involved and where were they? Because I feel like people in place, there's so much of what, so much of the flavor and the depth of what's happening comes from people in place. Like, where did something happen? Music that is made in Memphis has a different feel than music that is made somewhere else. Music that is made by a guy in Memphis who had like a really tough upbringing and, just did his own thing and didn't have any kind of help and had to fight and scrape his way through every day. That's going to have a different feeling than anything else. So like all these things kind of, it's a stew. A story is a stew and all these ingredients have to go into it. And in my personal opinion, the two most important ingredients to any story are people in place. And by the way, like read a novel, like a novelist is someone who evokes both story and atmosphere. And story is, is people, is the people in it. The guy who wrote Deadwood, David Milch, he made this quote or this statement one time, and I'll paraphrase. Basically, it was plot is the emotional reaction of the main character. And essentially, like something has happened, how I respond to it is the plot of my own personal story. So Grady, the history of EMS in Atlanta, the history of EMS in Pittsburgh, the neighborhood that John came from, one of the main characters of American Sirens came from in Atlanta, the neighborhood he came from, Pittsburgh. Those things, seasoned him and created this thing in him that he would have been a different person had he lived in any other two towns. And so, to me, that's just where you have to start. And so they all kind of come back. All of my stories always come back to that.
So was American Sirens, was that just a natural progression from this love of history, or how did that project come about?
I desperately did not want to write a second EMS book. I got an email from someone who read Siren or Strangers. I was like, hey, read your book, liked it, but do you know how it all began? Have you ever heard of this thing called Freedom House? And I had not. And one of the things that struck me about that was my instructor was one of the first 6 paramedics in the state of Georgia. His number was like 4, something like that.
Wow.
And he had these great stories of the days in Atlanta pre-paramedics, when those guys started out at funeral homes and working in hearses and embalming one night, transporting the next, sweeping flower petals out of the back of the hearse to go run a call, not having any equipment, having to borrow a towel from, the wife of the guy who's bleeding. These ambulances racing each other to a call because the only money they made was what they charged. And, he would hand out a credit card machine and before he let his patient off of his stretcher into the hospital, or the hospital bed, he would say cash, check, or charge, with one of those like old school things. And so I was versed in the history. I knew that we had this thing. I knew that the white paper existed. I knew that one moment there's funeral homes and the next moment there's Johnny and Roy. But I never stopped to think like, whoa, what's the bridge between these two things? How did that happen? You hear about like, oh, there's the EMS Act of 73 or 71, whenever it was. And you think like, oh, that must have done it. Well, that's just not the case. And so when I started researching and realized that there was this thing, I was intrigued, but I didn't know that it was going to be a story. Like, what does that really mean? Like, oh, there were some guys who came out in 1967 who were the first paramedics. All right. Like, okay. But then the more I started to research them and realized like how they got there and the person who drew up their training program, and then who these guys were and kind of the neighborhood that they came from, and how what happened to that neighborhood was the same thing that was happening to neighborhoods all across the country. And so these guys become this microcosm for what's happening to people in low income majority Black neighborhoods all over the US. And so suddenly it's not a story about paramedics anymore. It's a story about the US in the 1960s. It's a story about how, and of course this is 2020 when I'm writing it, but the story of like this, how our medical system was not up to the moment, at the time of the white paper. And so just a lot of really interesting, exciting threads were all coming together, and nobody had ever sat down and connected them all. And it
so what was that like when you, tell us about that process of how did you even get in touch with some of these people, and what was their initial reaction? I mean, obviously they have, we know that they've tried to tell their story before, in one of the documentaries that has yet to be picked up. But what was kind of their reaction when you kind of reopened this?
Pretty much everybody I called just started talking. It was not easy to find people. Yeah. I mean, look, these guys have been trying to tell the story since before I was born. So, someone coming along to say, hey, I'm going to do this. It was definitely initially some skepticism in terms of like, is anything going to come of this? Is this, are you going to write some story that's going to appear in, some newspaper in, Topeka? I don't know. I don't know if they knew where it was going to go, but there was almost no resistance at all. Or, there certainly was not any concern about who I was. I just called them up and said, "Hey, look, I'm a former paramedic. I wrote this book about it. Somebody told me about you guys. I think this is insane. This is fascinating. I want to know more about it. Let's talk." And they just did. They just started talking. And then, of course, you realize instantly that the whole thing spills open. But I mean, it started out with honestly phone calls and phone calls and phone calls and phone calls. Just, there were stories that appeared through the years. So I would scan them and pick up names, and I would just go to various like directories of various cities and call everybody with that name. Get hung up on a lot. And,
Dude, that's crazy.
Yeah. And, and then like hitting people up on Facebook, which, that can be helpful, and just tracking down names, just tracking down people. And
did you, specifically John Moon, did you know about his attachment to the city of Atlanta prior to, working on this book or working on the project?
No, in fact, it took a long time to get to that because they had been interviewed dozens of times for either like a local newspaper or a city magazine piece. And nobody had ever told the big story. So they were used to giving, I say they, John and a couple of people I spoke to, specifically John, were used to giving soundbite answers. And so he would just, like I noticed some of the stories he told me I'd seen in other things. So I was like, oh man, I've got to figure out a way to get this guy just have a long conversation, just the two of us. So I can get past, 30 or 40 years of pat answers.
Mm-hmm.
And we were probably talking for the better part of 6 or 7 months before I realized that he'd started out in Atlanta. His mom had died the way she died, that he got adopted, and that he really resented his adopted parents for years. It took a while to get to that because he was just trying to give me sort of the pieces of this bigger story. And, he was just used to someone sort of skating along on a very surface level. And, I just kept going back and saying, well, hold on. What happened here? How did this start? How did you get there? Who was living there? How did that happen? How did your mother die? Let me tell you something. When you're sitting there looking someone in the eye and you say to them, hey, how did your mother die? It's a very awkward thing to ask, but are you going to tell the story or not? And he could have told me to, F off. He could have said a lot of things. But to his credit, he just was honest. And I think most people, when it comes right down to it, like if they're going to talk, they want you to get the whole story. They want you to get the story right.
Absolutely. Did you kind of not forewarn? Did you prepare him? Say, look, man, I'm going to ask you some questions that may be uncomfortable. I mean, or was it just casual conversation?
Yeah, the way I approach an interview I've never thought about it actually until this very second. Like a boxing match where you just try to like, you try to sound out your distance. And then you try to soften them up with some easy ones, some light jabs. And then once you feel like you've got a sweat going and you guys are engaged with each other, then that's when you throw the big one.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I usually do it, is I just start the conversation and I do my best to let someone know that I'm emotionally invested. And then, because this is about trust. If you want someone to divulge personal information to you, they have to trust, not like, oh, you're not going to tell anybody, but they have to trust like the person I'm talking to wants to get this story right. They're not as invested in the story as I am because it's my story, but they're invested enough to put in the work to really do it. And so that's not a question I would have asked the first few interviews, even if I had known, because that just feels like something you need to earn.
Well, and especially coming from people who have earned a lot or have been mistrusted and misrepresented and misquoted and quite honestly just lied to. I can imagine their apprehension with some of this.
Yeah.
Describe to us a little bit. I can tell you that I'm kind of in the same boat as you were, and I think a lot of people before reading this book, it's almost a little embarrassing that we don't teach this regularly, or this doesn't become a part of us. I'll tell you that in some of the EMT programs I've run, in going through the history of EMS, I've loosely mentioned Freedom House, but really only because of Safar's work with Freedom House. So can you kind of take us through a little bit of kind of how that relationship was developed a little bit? Because I think that's kind of fascinating, just who Peter Safar was, and, being maybe a someone that's not from the United States. He didn't necessarily have all the same baggage that came with the political climate that was happening in the late 60s. And so why it probably took somebody like him to kind of have this forward thinking to be able to be into that area and kind of have the vision to kind of pull off what he did.
So, Peter Safar, as you said, he's not American. He's an Austrian-born, and ultimately Austrian-born anesthesiologist, but he grows up in his family. His mother is part Jewish, not a lot Jewish, just like, I don't know. I forget what the percentage is, but it's not a large percentage. It's a small enough percentage that when the Nazis annexed Austria, his family was not at risk of being sent to a concentration camp. But life was not easy for them. His mother was labeled a Mischling, which is the German version of a mixed thing, which means you're partially Jewish. And she was a physician. His parents met each other while dissecting bodies in medical school. They both wind up losing their jobs, and they raise Safar and his sister, in the shadow of the war. The Russians are coming in. It's, Eastern Front was insanely brutal. It was an incredibly risky life that they led. In fact, Safar's wife's family ran a jewelry store that was bombed. And he survives World War II by the skin of his teeth. And between nearly being sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians and, at least being under the shadow of Nazis, Judaism, Holocaust, he emerges from that with this tremendous sense of both like survivor's guilt, why me and not, 70 million other people, but also this feeling of being a world citizen, that, nationalist urges had created the greatest, cataclysm that the world had ever seen. The history's, most brutal meat grinder was the direct result of one nation, insisting on having its way over others. So he wanted to be a world citizen. He emerges from that very much a liberal, but he's also insanely smart, and he's incredibly driven. And so he studied as a surgeon, knew that surgery was not the kind of place where he could make a mark in the world. Surgery had been around for a long time, and he was looking for a place where he could change the world. Comes across anesthesiology when he gets to the U.S., because back in Austria, it was still literally like holding an ether-soaked rag over a patient's nose. Gets to the U.S., sees it. Oh, wait, we actually, you're giving IV medications. People are being intubated. This is very advanced. So he switches, gets into anesthesiology, and it's while working as an anesthesiologist in Baltimore at Baltimore City Hospital that he's looking around, discovers two things kind of at once. One, that the way that we did CPR was, or at least rescue breathing, was totally ineffective. I mean, it was very much positional. And also he came across a study that said, which is funny, you think about it now, it's obvious. We've known it for decades, but at the time this was revolutionary. He came across a study that said there was enough oxygen in expired air to keep you alive. People still thought that you could die by breathing, or kill someone by breathing into their mouth, that there would be enough carbon dioxide to kill them. Or carbon monoxide. So he says, okay, I'm going to take these two things. I'm going to take this study about expired air, and I'm going to take my skepticism about this positional form of rescue breathing, which wasn't rescue breathing. It was just trying to shift the body around so that the lungs would expand on their own by muscle contraction and let oxygen into the body. And he devises a series of tests. I mean, if you think about for a second how crazy this is, he gets volunteers, and he says, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sedate you, and you're going to lie on the floor for 8 hours at a time. And you're not going to be able to breathe because you're going to be sedated and paralyzed. And then I'm going to use this method that because I've told you is totally ineffective. And when it kills you, which it's going to kill you, I'm going to bring over a Boy Scout, and I'm going to give him 30 seconds worth of training. I'm going to teach him how to do rescue breathing, and he's going to keep you alive for the rest of the day. And he convinced people to do that.
Bro, volunteer. He did not pay them. They volunteered.
I mean, think about, this wasn't like, the old thing where like, you're trying to get, musicians and college students, to give blood or something. Like these are doctors, these are nurses, these are medical students, these are people who are financially secure, or at least are on the path to being financially secure. And they do it. They volunteer. He runs a series of tests. By late 50s, he publishes his results, which, leave no doubt the old method doesn't work. Rescue breathing does, in fact, save lives. He pairs that with chest compressions, and boom, that's it. Single-handedly, a single human being, all by himself at 35 years old, with no help from anybody and certainly no faith from anybody, creates CPR, changing forever how millions of people will live or die around the world. And he then takes that same approach to Pittsburgh. He goes to Pittsburgh to open an anesthesiology department at Pitt. Pittsburgh at that time was as bad as any city in America for its EMS. Basically, what you'd have, depending on where you lived, would be the volunteer fire services, the police, or the funeral homes. Pittsburgh had the police. They were notoriously ineffective. They often did not show up to black neighborhoods. They always showed up to white neighborhoods, but they never did anything. They didn't have any equipment. They had very little training. They would grab you, toss you on a canvas stretcher, put you in the back of the ambulance, close the doors and drive away, and you would ride alone to live or die by yourself. So, I mean, it wasn't, it was essentially a cab. That's all it was. And, by himself, again, he devises a paramedic curriculum before the word exists, which is, if you guys are paramedics. One of you is a paramedic instructor. You're well aware of what people are both taught and capable of today. Every single thing that we do today in 2022, turning into 2023, he came up with in 1965 when he sat down and drew up this program. I mean, like everything from, telemetry to 12 leads to narcotics, cardiac drugs, everything you can think of. It was all there, treating asthmatics, everything, the whole thing. Redesigns the ambulance because what we had at that time was either a hearse or some version of a paddy wagon. He's the one who put the captain's chair at the head of the patient because as an anesthesiologist, he was really determined that people would be able to manipulate and control an airway. He was the one who mandated wall-mounted suction. He didn't have people. He has got this insanely, brilliant, life-changing idea. He's got nobody to carry it out. But there it is, all by himself. He develops a paramedic curriculum, and then now he just needs to find some people to take this class. And that was kind of where, again, what you were talking about earlier, this story shifts from simply being a medical story to being a much larger, much richer, much more complicated, genuinely American story. And that's, what brings us to Freedom House in the Hill District.
So in your research, certainly you have to make some assumptions here because you didn't get to speak with Dr. Safar. What was it about this group of people that it's fairly it's fairly counterintuitive to take the folks that are maybe not of higher education, and if you're trying to start something that you want to be successful, maybe you go to the medical schools or the graduate programs and you take them and say, we want these folks to be what would become paramedics. What was it about this group that you think he saw as a group to go after and still presuming he could be successful?
Well, luckily, he wrote about this, and some of the people who were in the room talked to me. So I was able to find exactly what was going through his mind. But essentially, two things. One, people have been trying this for a very, very long time. And what they found was that doctors were not willing to do it, and nurses weren't willing to do it. You were going to have to develop a new brand of professional. So that was one. The second was he needed to prove that this idea was reproducible. It'd be one thing for him to create a program in Pittsburgh that's really advanced and is very successful and that nobody can ever do again. That's not what he wanted. Right around that time, City of San Francisco's got this basically cardiac tech program, but it's run by all former World War II medics and Vietnam medics. They had tons and tons of training, but all they could do is basically they were just cardiac techs, but very few places would have the pool of guys who had come back with that much training. You could stick into a job like that. So like nobody else did that. Belfast did it. It's like 2 cities in the world were doing this thing. It just wasn't reproducible. And so he needed ordinary, very specifically, I need people who are not established professionals, who are not medical professionals, who don't have any kind of advanced education, the sort of people who are going to come in and be this particular professional. I mean, he somehow was foreseeing 2023. Aren't we having a discussion right now about whether or not medics should have a 4-year degree? He was in 65, he's saying to himself, these are probably people who aren't going to have a 4-year degree. And so when Freedom House approaches him, because their idea was, hey, let's create this very low-key ambulance service where we'll just take people to and from appointments, to and from the hospital. They have no access to healthcare. This would be great. We'll have some local drivers, put them in a van and we'll go. I mean, they were essentially proposing to him a wheelchair service. And he said, I have zero interest in that, and I'm not going to do it. However, if you have the people for this wheelchair service, let's turn them into something real. And here's my plan to turn them into something real. And over the course of a 2-hour conversation, he basically laid out the tenets for what would be this medical revolution that we now call the paramedic. And the guys who ran Freedom House were looking specifically for this kind of an opportunity. It was a jobs training program, not just any job, but a real job, a job people could be proud of. And they listened to this and they said, well, damn, that's what we want.
If you don't mind, while we're still on the subject of Safar, will you touch on, because dude, this hit me hard, reading through when he would actually stand up for his students while on clinical, because the patients did not want to be touched by a black man, or they did not, in the labor and delivery areas. You mind speaking on that for a sec? Because to me, that said everything I needed to hear about Dr. Safar.
Yeah. As you guys mentioned earlier, he wasn't from the U.S. So he didn't have, a good grip on racial politics in this country. But in his mind, these were guys who were trying to perform a job and, let them perform. How can you possibly learn how to deliver babies if you don't allow them in to deliver babies? And, whether like sometimes they would go into the ER and a nurse would hand them a mop, presuming them to be an orderly. The nurses in the OB ward physically barred the door and would not let them pass. So he would just run down there. And, basically, I mean, he's a small guy. He talked incredibly fast, a really thick Austrian accent. And, kind of sounded like a mad scientist. And he would go in and he had this wavy kind of crazy hair. And he would go in and just have to try to convince these women that, no, you have to trust these guys, and especially, I know it still exists today, but particularly in the 60s, you have this group of black men and they are standing across from this group of white women. That is, I mean, if you were to draw, if you wanted to do the lazy version of a hotly contested situation, like that's how you would draw it up. So, I mean, these are two groups that typically, exist on the opposite side of sort of like fear and frustration and misunderstanding. And he would have to find a way to bridge that gap. And he did it time and again. And to him, he didn't understand why it was a big deal, but he knew that it was. And so he would just come down and fight for them repeatedly. And he wanted his guys to go through essentially, residency. That's what a medical student does when they finish in the classroom. They go through all these different areas and and that's what he was building.
Were those actions and that advocacy, did John talk about that? Did that resonate within John? Like, hey, here's this guy who actually cares about me. I mean, what was, whenever you and John were having those conversations, did he ever speak about that?
Safar walking into the room was like the president walking into the room.
Oh, wow.
So he existed to a degree at a remove. That's how he felt about Nancy Caroline, but she was, of course, she's a very driven person of her own mind, but she was handed Safar's idea. And so, all of that was baked in, this idea, like you're just going to kick down doors and people are going to resist you and, to hell with them, you're going to do it anyway. And Nancy being Nancy, she was always spoiling for a fight, and she was always looking for, anyone who's going to resist her, and then she would go and confront them. But she also was wily and, knew that like there was a way to work the system. And she would bring these guys into all kinds of areas that were labeled as restricted, and she would give them unfettered access. And not just access, but she would empower them when they walk through the room. I mean, you've at some point or another, you have either been on a clinical rotation or your patient has been so critical when you walked into the ER that you immediately get swept into the OR and very quickly realize like, oh, wow, I'm a background instrument player in this orchestra, and everybody wants me to just sort of hug the wall and stay out of the way. Nancy would bring them into those situations and empower them to be upfront, asking questions, doing things, saying things. And that was huge for those guys. They had to this day, if you bring her name up around Freedom House Medics, the love that they have for her and the respect and that bond that was formed over what was really, frankly, a short period of time. It endures, and it comes back to exactly what you're talking about, this feeling of like, you kick down this door for me. You help, like her job. And I think I wrote it somewhere, like her job was to kick the door open. They were the ones who had to walk through. So, she threw it open, and then it was like, well, are you going to take this opportunity and make the most of it? And if you are, then go do that.
And that's the crazy thing about this story, not being told the way that it should have been over the last 50 plus years, is that Nancy Caroline, everyone knows her because of her name on the front of the textbook.
Yep.
That's what everybody knows her for, but that's not where her brilliance was. In fact, she set the standard for EMS medical directors, doing exactly those things that you just said, but also riding in the units with these folks, making sure the quality was there, going over, re-educating. I mean, she really embodied what we want a medical director to do in 2023. Many of them fall short. But to me, that's what she should be known for. She was a pioneer in this, and yet, everyone knows her for the textbook, but doesn't know really her, what kind of person she was and the standard she set and the lives she impacted because of those things that you just mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, and there was a human side to her, there's this other part of her that, this sort of very, adventurous and curious mind that was always reaching for something. And that was, it opened the door for her to be something more than just a clinician. She was a human being on the ambulance. And I've talked to guys from Israel, doing research to try to figure out what it was that she did over there. They have the same feeling. She is unbelievably revered. It's kind of shocking when you talk to Israeli medics, and they, like, she is the mother of the EMS there. And, I mean, she also started their hospice program, but it's her work with MDA, the National EMS System, that stands out. There was a very famous terrorist attack along the coast, and she was one of the first people on scene. She spent the entire day there, under fire, running in and out of a burning bus, getting patients, both Arab and Palestinian and Israeli, and treating them, and bringing them to the hospitals while PLO militants were still firing. So, I mean, she was an incredibly dedicated person, who left a tremendous amount of awe in everyone who ever worked with her. And we remember her as this name on a textbook, which you assume is like, oh, it's somebody who wrote a book and whatever. You don't realize the depths of the human being who's behind that name. And I mean, it's remarkable.
So, Kevin, take us through kind of, not for any spoilers, because we want people to really kind of get in. You really got to read this book to get kind of all the nuts and bolts and all the real history. But take us through how successful this was, and how did they actually, measure that success? Not just scientifically, but a little, anecdotally of, some of your stories of people desiring, for Freedom House medics to show up, not the police department. Kind of take us through on how successful the program actually became over the next, what was it, 5 or 6 years?
Well, it's wildly successful from day one. It is clear the moment they hit the streets that this is a branch of medicine that is not only viable, but absolutely critical, and no city can do without it. The study is done, and, the numbers are the numbers, but, they do this study of critical patients transported by the volunteer fire department, the police, and by Freedom House. And the police and the volunteer fire services were doing the wrong thing 70 or 80% of the time. And Freedom House is doing the right thing 80% of the time. So, I mean, it doesn't even, there's no comparison in terms of what these guys are doing. But, anecdotally, it's unbelievable. They were resisted heavily by the police for a lot of reasons. And there's a story that they all tell because it was screamed over the radio. There's a child who's hit by a bus in a wealthy white neighborhood called Squirrel Hill. His leg was cut off. First police officer on the scene is panicking, and he's screaming into his radio for help. And he says, "Send Freedom House." So a Freedom House unit jumps in their ambulance, and they start driving. And the dispatcher says, "Well, that's out of their area. I'm going to go ahead and cancel them." And he said, "No, I need someone who knows what the hell they're doing. Send Freedom House." Now, these were guys who had been fighting Freedom House from the very beginning because Freedom House quite literally represented jobs that they were losing. Two, it's really no secret that the police and people living in Black neighborhoods do not get along. There's a long history of that. And philosophically, they were on different sides of what EMS should be. And, that fight was ugly, and it was bitter, and it was prolonged. It existed the entire 7 years that Freedom House was in operation. And yet here they were screaming for Freedom House. There's another thing where in the mid 70s, this heroin epidemic had swept across Pennsylvania and finally reached Pittsburgh. And because Safar was an anesthesiologist, he said, "Well, I know how to reverse that. We've got this drug in OR called Narcan. I'll just teach my guys how to use it, and they'll get these people breathing again." So they do. They go out and they start treating heroin overdoses with Narcan in the 70s, which of course today is about as commonplace as it gets. Every time police hear the word fentanyl, they're squirting it in their faces. But then it was very novel, and the deaths start going down immediately in Black neighborhoods, and then they start going up in white neighborhoods. So people say, "Well, wait a minute, what's going on? Why is it that these people that live over here in this, this rundown neighborhood that has almost no city services, how are they surviving when we're dying?" And the answer was Freedom House. It was quite simple. So, I mean, and if that wasn't enough to convince someone, the fact that doctors from around the country are coming in to say, "Hey, what are you guys doing over here?" Mm-hmm. Not everybody became, the next version of Freedom House, but an awful lot of cities cherry picked either small pieces, huge chunks, or the entire thing and brought it home with them to replicate.
And you touched on something there that I know you've spoken on this before, but to me, this is a subject that can't go untouched, is the parallels between whenever you just brought up how it's no secret that, Black community and neighborhoods of that nature and the police did not get along. It doesn't seem like anything has changed decades and decades and decades later. Is that something, if you don't mind me asking, if this is too personal, then we can cut this out, but is that something that any of the men that you interviewed to build the body of this book, is that anything that resonated through them? And is that something that, what brought you to realize that? John
certainly talked about it. When I would ask him, he would sort of shake his head and say, "Yeah, it feels like, the more things change, the less, or the more they stay the same." But, I wrote this book in the wake of George Floyd. So there's all this stuff happening. There are people, marching in cities across America, and, it felt, at least from my vantage point, that we were as divided racially as we had been in my lifetime. And, I'm writing this story about that essentially is about the 1960s. And I grew up thinking that the 1960s were kind of the nadir of U.S. race relations. And here we were in that same exact position again. Some of the things that exist in the 60s clearly do not exist today, but the fundamentals haven't changed. People's view of one another has not changed. The fact that, we've all spent time at Grady. If you run a call on Simpson Road, you're not going to find a lot of white people. And that is a neighborhood that you don't really want to spend a lot of time in, on your free time. Those kind of things still exist and will continue to exist. Those are persistent problems. And that was what they were up against, the things that created their neighborhood, the things that created the need in these young men to try to do something with their lives, the things that created the backlash to their success. They're there today. And they know that. And I think that's probably, for me, it's kind of like weird to like, weird's the wrong word. I don't know what's the right word I'm trying to think. It's sad, I guess, that we're still in that place. But I think for them, having lived through it once and now to realize like, I'm going to die and it's still going to be here, I think is quite frustrating.
So when, I forget when it was, 1974, so 1975, when you talk about the new mayor coming into Pittsburgh, and the dynamic starts to change over funding and those kinds of things, and kind of their Freedom House paramedics job descriptions and kind of their opportunities. When those kinds of things hit, do those just become I don't really know how to, not the usual way, but do they just kind of look at that and go, yeah, this is pretty much the way things go for these types of programs, that they're not long lasting. Someone's going to come in and cut it. Were they surprised when that changed, or was that just kind of something that they got used to?
I think they were surprised. It followed a lot of patterns, but this was something that was beginning to happen. Emergency, I think, premiered in 1971. The nation is waking up to the new reality. And the new reality, of course, is that well-trained paramedics are on streets all across the country. So I think that they were as successful as they knew they were, as successful as other people considered them to be, and yet not only face skepticism, but very fierce resistance from their own local government, I think was a shock and an enduring frustration. I don't think that they expected to have good relationships with the police. I think they knew from the get-go that was going to be a very complicated relationship, that they were simply always going to be on the, that power dynamic was never going to be in their favor. But they didn't expect the city to continue to throw hurdles at them. They didn't think that they would have to fight for their professional lives every single day. And so, yeah, I think that was, it continued to be a shock, even though they did their best to ignore it and tune out the noise and just go to work. I think it was very hard to do.
So why do you think, just kind of globally here, why do you think that this story has not been told the way it should?
On the one hand, ambulances do not get the sort of attention, excitement, whatever, that fire trucks and soldiers and police do. It's just a different thing, even though it's not. In people's minds, it's a different thing. So I think that's part of it. I think that's probably a big chunk of it. And then I think also the lion's share of the blame goes to the fact that, we have watched Tom Hanks go to the moon like 50 times. And all those 50 times you watched Tom Hanks go to the moon, did anybody say the name Katherine Johnstone? That just simply was not a part of our history that we valued and wanted to spend a whole lot of time shining a light on. And so it was always just, like there are certain things that we revere and certain things that we don't. And the contributions of Black Americans oftentimes have just simply not gotten the attention that they deserve.
Well, actually, and you may have answered it. My next question though was, why did Johnny and Roy take off so much? What was it because of the? Do you think that was racial, or was it just the sexiness of a fire department connects more with the general public?
I think the sexiness of the fire department connects. I think their casting, I mean, let's be perfectly honest, in 1971, there's no way a major network would have cast, even if they had decided, like, hey, let's set this thing after the first people. With the funny thing is at the time that Emergency comes out, not only has LA been beaten to the punch by Freedom House, but the LA firefighters still needed a nurse to ride with them in order for them to practice medicine. They didn't yet have the ability to do that by themselves. But I don't think that there's a major American network that would have featured a television show on prime time with one or two black main characters. I don't think America was in that place. I've been working in TV for a very short period of time. When I first started, somebody told me, make sure your main character is a white guy so people can identify with him. Felt weird to me in 2014 or 2012, whatever year it was, for someone to tell me that, but there you have it. So I don't think that anybody was ready or willing or interested in telling that kind of story in 1971. And, the truth is, it is an exciting job. If you cherry pick the exciting calls, it's certainly very dramatic, and it lends itself. I mean, those shows exist to this day. There are, a jillion EMS shows on. So Johnny and Roy happen to be the first ones to come on, and they put a lot of stock in veracity. If you watch that show, like, there's not a whole lot of like, quick, get the crowbar and crack his chest open so I can give him, you don't see that. I mean, it felt pretty real, but they weren't going to make those guys black. They just, that wasn't going to happen.
What do you think? And I know that we're probably running close on time here. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
What, and it's hard to put this question into words, but what do you think it would take in order for John and the surviving members of Freedom House? I know that American Sirens makes them feel very validated and makes them feel like their story's being told for sure. What would it take, do you think, for them to understand that their legacy has not been ignored? It has, resounded through the current generations, and that their true story has been told. What do you think it would take for them to walk away feeling that?
I think seeing their story taught in EMT schools, I think, there being some sort of larger memorialization of it. I don't know how all those things work, but that Johnny and Roy they're some of their stuff is in the Smithsonian. Not to take anything away from those guys, like, this was not their fault. This was not a problem they created, but the fictional paramedics are in the Smithsonian. I think we could be honoring the legacy of these guys by doing something. That is where we put our national treasures. The very first police officers, I don't know who they are. Maybe somebody knows who they were. Maybe that history exists somewhere, but they're certainly not alive. We have the opportunity to sort of literally reach out and touch, among the first people. And we should take an opportunity to do that. And, so in those kind of places where we honor our national traditions, that's where it should go. But I think people who enter the field should just have an understanding of, like, hey, back in the beginning, there was this group of guys who helped to pioneer the stuff that you're doing today. And, I think that would go a very long way.
Yeah, I would actually put out a call to people who write the textbooks. I think this should be the first chapter in the textbook of how do we get where we are, and who were those that pioneered the way for us to be able to do what we get to do. And we certainly want to be able to honor them. Well, I want to kind of I'll wrap it up with me, and Kevin, I'll just tell you that I was actually having a conversation recently with someone, actually last weekend, about it seems interesting that kind of talking about people that write music, so lyricists, poets, writers. To me, as a consumer, or as someone who experiences that, one of the benefits that or one of the things that I get to experience is having people like you and others put words down on paper in ways that I can't express myself, yet when I read them, I say, that's exactly what I mean. And I think you have the ability to do that. I appreciate how you have represented our profession with objectivity, with honesty, with vulnerability. I hope that everyone that wants to go into this profession, it becomes almost mandatory reading for these two books, and I really mean that. I think these really set out a way of not only expectations, but just the truth and honesty of what we get to do. That it's not all about life and death. Very little of what we do is about life and death, but a lot is these building these relationships and understanding people and impacting people, and it may take more than one contact with them to impact them, but to hear how you and others have paved the way for us, I want to tell you that I personally appreciate that.
Oh man, it means more than you can imagine. It's incredibly humbling anytime I hear people, not just about the writing, but also when somebody mentions anything about representing EMS in any kind of way. It was not what I was setting out to do. I didn't think anybody from EMS would read any of these books, or at least the first one. So it has been a very humbling experience to see the reaction that has come from it, and I'm honored beyond words by that. And I will tell you that writing is a lonely experience with a ton of self-doubt. So anytime somebody says, "Hey, what you did spoke to me," it means a lot, because I can tell you each sentence in any book that you read that's worth a damn, the person who wrote that sentence spent a lot of time thinking over it, and they had you in mind. They wanted your experience as you worked your way through that sentence to be worth your time. I know that's certainly how I feel. So it is, I don't take those sort of compliments lightly.
Awesome, man.
So how can people get in touch with you, or how can they find your books?
Well, any bookstore, man, any local bookstore, it's out there. Obviously, you can get it online as well. I'm on all the social media places. Don't do a whole lot of TikTok dancing, but other than that,
good. I want to boycott TikTok, man. That's one that needs to go away.
Awesome.
But
I'm everywhere else. Yeah.
Right on. Well, man, thank you so much for your time, and this has truly been an honor. So,
well, I appreciate it, guys, very much. Very,
yes,
very
sir.
much. Happy to do it.